it's weird that a 160-year-old book can be, man, that feels like somebody wrote it in modern times. Feels very relatable.
Well, like I said, it took me 10 tries to get into it. And then doing research, post-reading about all this stuff that we talked about in this preamble, as we're calling it, I was like, oh, this is more than a decent book. This is a good book. There's a reason why it's a classic, and Dostoevsky didn't just pull it out of his posterior. Hey, SideQuesters. Today we're diving into Crime and Punishment. To understand Crime and Punishment, you have to understand the author, the time period, and the country. Because here's the thing. If you pick up this book cold, without any background, it's tough. It took me 10 attempts to get through it the first time. Part of it was not understanding the context, and part of it was just bad timing in my life. But once I learned about the author, the time period, and Russia itself, everything clicked. Suddenly, it wasn't just a dense Russian novel, it became a gripping psychological thriller. This isn't a whodunit murder mystery. We know who did it from page 1. It's a whodunit. A claustrophobic plunge into a man's mind as he convinces himself he is above morality, commits a horrific act, and then gets crushed by guilt and conscience. To really get it, we need to set the context. So let me set the stage. The country, the era, the author, the city, and then the book itself. Most 19th century writers wrote for their own time and their own country. They assumed their readers an intimate knowledge of Imperial Russian life and a familiarity with all sorts of details with which modern students of their work cannot easily acquaint themselves. 19th century writers belonged to the Gentry, a land-owning class, often minor or impoverished branches, but some from higher social strata, reflecting the emerging Intelligentsia from non-noble origins. Dostoevsky wasn't some ivory tower writer. His life was pure drama, suffering, near death, and redemption that directly fed into his books. Born in 1821, second of 7 kids on the grounds of a hospital for the poor in Moscow, his dad was a doctor there, the family had gentry status, but unlike richer writers like Tolstoy or Turgenev, Dostoevsky came from humbler roots, yet still had good stock, as they say. Dostoevsky's paternal ancestors were part of Russian nobility and part of Russian Orthodox Christian heritage. Dostoevsky's immediate ancestors on his mother's side were merchants. He was introduced to literature and the classics at a very early age. Aged 4, he had more exposure to literature than most. Events like the death of his father and mother, having to fetch his father to attend to a 9-year-old rape victim, shaped him throughout his youth. A prodigious reader, informed on philosophy, Dostoevsky's characters probe emotions that were just being studied then. His life, trauma, spiritual rebirth, rejection of radical Western ideas, for Russia's sacred mission, this all shaped his obsession with guilt, redemption, and suffering's power. Russian literature shifted from the golden age of poetry, 1820s, Pushkin and his contemporaries, through Romanticism in the 1830s, to prose realism in the 1840s. Realism fully emerged in the 1840s with an explosion of talent, specifically Dostoevsky's Poor Folk in 1846 and Turgenev's Sportsman Sketches in 1847. Key traits of Russian realistic fiction are preferences for contemporary Russian settings and life, straightforward functional style, detailed factual descriptions of landscape, dress, physical appearance, and deep human sympathy. Characters are neither simply good nor bad, but deserving of understanding. Serious philosophical engagement with human existence, destiny, and moral questions all encapsulate this era. He graduated as a military engineer, but quit to write full-time. His first big hit, Poor Folk, in 1845, made him famous overnight. Then, disaster struck. In 1849, arrested for joining the Petersburg Circle, a group discussing radical socialist ideas, he was locked in prison for months, condemned to death, and subjected to a mock execution. He was tied to a post facing a firing squad, only for a messenger to arrive at the last second with a commutation from Tsar Nicholas. Instead of death, he had 4 years of hard labor in the Siberian prison camp. Surrounded by brutal criminals and sometimes even more brutal guards, Then he spent more years in exile as a soldier. This broke him and remade him. He rejected the radical Western ideas he flirted with and embraced a deeper faith in Russian Orthodoxy and the sacred mission of the Russian people. Suffering for him became the path to spiritual rebirth, a core theme in Crime and Punishment. Back in St. Petersburg by 1859, he threw himself into writing and debates. Crime and Punishment, published in 1886, critiques the very radical ideologies that nearly killed him. Russia in the mid-1800s, a mess of contradictions. Russia was always playing catch-up with Europe, socially, politically, and industrially. The Zars pushed back against change to hold power, and the rigid cultural identity didn't help. Reforms under Tsar Nicholas II, like emancipating the serfs in 1861, were a double-edged sword. They aimed to modernize, but sparked unrest, inequality, and eventually fueled the 1917 revolution. Autocratic empire under the Zars, 1712 to 1917, had 85% of the population under serfdom, basically slaves tied to the land. There were huge class divides, the royals, the Intelligentsia, a tiny bourgeoisie class, and masses of peasants. The 1860s, oppressive censorship, but also heated debates. There's a big split between the Westernizers, those who sought to emulate Europe and the rule of law, versus the Slavophiles, who thought Russia's unique path through orthodoxy and peasant traditions would lead it forward. Both sides wanted free speech, an ending of serfdom, but radicals went further: nihilism, positivism, and socialism. Turgenev, a contemporary of Dostoevsky, coined nihilism in his book Fathers and Sons, arguing to demolish the old and build the new. However, as historians point out, the designation nihilism was a misnomer, as the radical Russian youth were far from believing in nothing. They placed great hope in the power of natural science to improve human life and were driven by a concern for those less privileged. Journals were the battlegrounds, thick monthlies mixing literature and politics, and Dostoevsky even ran his own, promoting Panche rooting in Russian soil, bridging the educated elite and the so-called regular people. In short, it supported the complete emancipation of serfs, stressed a strong desire to return to the idealized past of Russian history, and opposed Europeanization. They also advocated a complete rejection of nihilist, classical liberal of that time and Marxist movements, as Dostoevsky saw them. This is the intellectual climate Raskolnikov breeds: radical ideas clashing with conscience. The novel is set in St. Petersburg, Russia's glittering capital, but Dostoevsky shows the filthy underbelly, overcrowded slums, drunks and prostitutes, and poverty. A useful general reference is Utechin's concise encyclopedia of Russia, covering many aspects of Russia and Russian life. The entries are condensed and easily accessible and can provide a good introduction for many topics. Crime and Punishment gains much of its power by dramatizing Raskolnikov's alienation and search for identity. On leave from university, Raskolnikov commits a murder that nearly defies explanation. Ultimately is motivated by ideas prevailing in the intellectual climate. These ideas clash with Raskolnikov's inmost heart, his conscience. To engage readers both cognitively and emotionally, Dostoevsky devises an innovative narrative strategy that stages the collision between Raskolnikov's reason and feeling, his rationality and moral emotion. We know Raskolnikov is a murderer, but some of us want him to get away, maybe, at least initially. A final note on the city. When Dostoevsky wrote Crime and Punishment, its setting, St. Petersburg, was the capital of Russia and the country's administrative and cultural center. However, the city presented in the novel is not one of lavish households and important buildings. Instead, Dostoevsky focuses on its dark underbelly, filled with petty criminals, prostitutes, and alcoholics caught in the cycles of degradation and reflecting the filthy morality of the world. Raskolnikov navigates the city without thinking. He takes long, aimless walks because his poverty prevents him from being anywhere comfortable. Those places tend to cost money. The chaotic, cluttered streets he sees echo the chaotic, cluttered thoughts that plague his mind. Raskolnikov, a young, intelligent student from the provinces, is driven close to insanity by his miserable city life. Thus, St. Petersburg becomes physical representation of his suffering. Raskolnikov's St. Petersburg is filled with prejudice, inequality, and poverty. Confused and anxious figures stumble through the streets, unable to make sense of their environment. St. Petersburg is never the right temperature, never smells right, has constant deafening and terrifying noises, and generally seems inhospitable to human life. So much so that one of the few passers-by Raskolnikov notices during his perambulations is a woman trying to commit suicide. Yet people are drawn to the city, which despite its stresses, represents the only way to move upward. Raskolnikov and Azumkin's University is there, as are opportunities for men like Porfiry and, of course, women like Sonia. The city's duality symbolizes the cycles and conflicts that plague every character. Dostoevsky died in February 1881. His funeral drew thousands. Even his critics, both philosophical and artistic, agree that the one thing he did understand was the psychological implications of radicalism.
Dostoevsky lived a very full life, it sounds like. Also, time, I don't know if you guys ever go through this, but time back then, if you think about what it was like, was just so different. It's just a very different time. No, just me? Cool.
It was a different time. It was about 150 years ago.
Thanks, Slava. That was really valuable. No, like, they live different, right? Like, you think about today, you can get your car, you can go to the grocery store. These people are living in poverty where they're trying to have, and I don't know the exact money denomination
Rubles.
translation. Well, no. I was going to say it's rubles, but it's like there's kopecks, there's rubles. Like, which one of them is like a penny versus a dollar, right? Like, I don't know those denominations.
Kopek is the coin and rubles is the paper money.
Okay, so rubles was more than kopecks.
Yes.
Okay. Good to know. But my point stands. Like, they're scraping by. And even today, you could just get a credit card and live off of that until it maxes out. Right? Like, it's a very different time to be alive.
Especially for Russia, too. Russia has, at this point, is behind Europe and has been behind Europe for hundreds of years. And the Slavophiles don't like that, but they see a different way forward. The Westernizers, they're looking at the French Revolution, they're looking at the English Revolution, and they're looking to European writers, and they're saying that's what we need. We need a revolution like that, because 1800s, Russia still has serfs and the gentry. And there's this middle class of the Intelligentsia, the bourgeoisie. They see a need to change that because Russia is behind. Like, and that goes to what you're talking about. Because forget cars and credit cards.
Yeah.
You know, a poor person, quote unquote, in England is way better off than a poor person in Russia at this point. Their lives are drastically different.
So I'm going to say this back to you. You just confirm what I've heard to put it in more modern words. Russia realizes they're behind the times and they're trying to play catch up on a global scale at this stage. Is that fair?
Yeah, a certain class of people, yes.
Okay.
Some like it the way it is. People, you know, the
people at the top
class, yeah.
Yeah.
They like it. Even Alexander's reforms, which included ending of serfdom, included trial by jury, included representation at local governmental levels. All that was great, but it forced urbanization on a country that was, let's just say, 200 years behind the times. And all of a sudden, you do have cities like St. Petersburg. You do have these urban centers, but only a few people can take advantage of what that affords. The rest of them are Raskolnikov to some degree.
So Raskolnikov is the everyman in the story.
Yeah. His life, his status in life, let's put it that way. His status in life is pretty common for most people in Russia. Because you got to understand, 85% of the population is serfs, were serfs, then they get emancipated, then these urban centers open up, and that is a double-edged sword.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like it's a required change to make progress. However, the transition, nobody ever focuses on the transition period. The transition period is going to be bloody, messy, people are going to die, people are not going to like it. It's a lot of that stuff.
Yeah, and that was embraced by Raskolnikov. The extraordinary man theory or the great man theory, the Ubermensch. The people saw the status of their lives. They saw their new lot, and it doesn't look that different than their old lot. And they're like, well, there has to be extraordinary men willing to do whatever it takes to take Russia forward. For some of them, it was bloody revolution.
Yeah.
And that's what Dostoevsky argues against. Because when he gets arrested, he sees the brutality of both sides. And he sees the folly of violent upheavals. And then he embraces traditionalism, which sees that Christianity, specifically Russian Orthodox Christianity, which is just Greek Orthodoxy, he sees that, the Russian soul, the Russian ground, the Russian traditions, traditionalism, as the way forward. And he understands, or he thinks he understands, that all of it is suffering. And Russia is supposed to suffer to get through whatever this thing is that he's seen and living through. To get through to a better future, suffering will be involved. And any shortcuts through violent upheavals, he believes it's only detrimental to Russia's future.
Okay.
On the other end, you have people of the same class, the middle and upper classes. You got the intelligentsia, you got the bourgeoisie, who are business owners, merchants, and there's, strata in there too. They're looking at this even as people who have the means to survive, the former and the current lot, as I just mentioned. They're looking at this saying, this is still not good enough. We need what Europe has. And this is even after Alexander II's reforms. So for some of them, they want to use the serfs as the bludgeon against the imperial, family, and they see that. Well, they see what we just talked about. I just talked about a few seconds ago, that the great men must take great strides and extraordinary measures to get Russia out of where it is at. We have Alexander II's reforms. It brought about urbanization. It ended serfdom, which 85% of the population were serfs. It created representative governments in the local sections or whatever regions. Now they had local voted in representation. They also had jury trial by jury. That's what Alexander brought in, and all his reforms, which were like a complete 180 of Nicholas I, who was Tsar before him, and he's the guy who did the mock execution for the socialists for Dostoevsky was with, and he was just with their heads basically. All that changed with Alexander II, but we have the problems that we have in 1860s Russia, and the middle class, the intelligentsia, which is technically upper class, and we have the bourgeoisie, the authors who are part of the bourgeoisie and the gentry class. They're looking at it and going, this is still not good. We need what Europe has. And they're specifically looking at the French Revolution. Russians of this class were Francophiles during this time. And
during that time period, like, I know it can be sometimes difficult to imagine a time period that we weren't alive in. We can think back to, if we use our imagination, we can somewhat envision when our father was alive, what life was like then. You get to think about your grandparents, it gets a bit fuzzy. Before your grandparents, you don't have any connection to that time period. 1886, when this book was published, is 1 year after the American Civil War. So for somebody, an American like myself, and I believe everyone else here, is like trying to find something to connect to. It's like, okay, this is what was going on in our part of the world. We just finished the American Civil War, which had, big fight about slavery and stuff like that. You mentioned reforms, and that Russia's still, they're all still serfs at this time too. So looking to the rest of the world, like, hey, this stuff's going on elsewhere. You mentioned France, but having a connection to what's going on in America, that helped me place this in a time setting to think about what was going on here.
That's kind of what I was getting at earlier, is like, it's so far removed from where we're at today. I think you said it better than I did. I didn't realize until you made your comment I think you told me that before the show as well, some time ago, where it's like, hey, this happened a year after the Civil War, and it's like, okay, that's worlds apart. I read a Western or think about the Oregon Trail and think, okay, this stuff just, it's so far removed. It feels like fantasy.
That's 140. I'm doing bad at math right now. Is that 140 years ago?
150 or so.
160.
Yeah, it's a while ago. I mean, Josh, what about you? Like, do you comprehend this? Are you a big history buff?
I love history. So this stuff is fascinating to me, but it is very difficult to like put yourself in that environment and to really understand like what how people are living. So I completely agree. Like it is just so foreign, the fact that it is so far away. I mean, I do think that you can kind of look at like what like is going on in the world today to kind of get somewhat of a good understanding, like just like what we've seen in American politics over the last several years, and just like drastic changes, right? And like how disruptive that can be. And so like this is also just like, it seems like a very similar time period, right? Where I may not understand like their system and like how they're living, but like I can understand that like that drastic change that they may be going through. And even if it is like, the previous system is really leaving behind people, that change is just very disruptive.
Yeah, it certainly is. Serfdom is also something that it's just hard to comprehend. Like debtors' prisons, serfdom. I believe that I've talked about this before on the show, but like I just was going over my finances because I'm prepping taxes, whatever, and I'm 18 years into a student loan debt that I literally can't get out from under. That's criminal. Let me tell you why it's criminal. Which is why, even though I believe previously I wrote that Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment was the worst book ever written, I do resonate with Raskolnikov at least a little bit, because I believe that this loan is criminal and I am oppressed by the world. Because they charge me interest every day. And then any interest that's not paid by the end of the month becomes a new loan. And so the new loan is then charged interest every day. And if you extrapolate that, because percentages and interest rates are exponential, it like I borrowed 50 grand back in 2007 as an 18-year-old, whatever, kid going to film school. And it's 2025 and I can't get out from under this loan. I can't buy a house to provide for my wife and I. Like, it's criminal. It's literally criminal. Refining doesn't work because their percentages are just too competitive. It's awful. It's literally the worst. So, Raskolnikov, I get you.
Well, I actually think that there's a lot of stuff about him that a lot of people can identify with in a scary and sometimes depressing and concerning way sometimes. I know.
Totally.
You'd mentioned that, like, going earlier, all of the different things that had gone through in his life. I thought it was interesting that he would write the story then from a perspective of somebody whom he maybe was a past version of himself before going to prison, or it's somebody that is like, this is not the right way, and that he would make that person our protagonist, our main character, who we view the story through. And
that's exactly right.
Yet make him completely relatable. When I first went through this book, I listened to the audiobook while I was during the COVID lockdowns, and
woof,
I was working 60 hours a week, and was going through this. Like, there's a lot, like university educated person, not engaged in what they went to study. They're at a dead end thing, just like, and having no social connection with anybody. Yeah, it's not good.
Yeah, it's rough. It's weird that a 160-year-old book, or at least it feels weird. It's this disconnect, right? Like, a 160-year-old book can be, man, that feels like somebody wrote it modern times. Feels very relatable.
Well, for Dostoevsky, he's born on the grounds where his dad is a doctor, but the grounds are a hospital for the poor. So he sees this poverty, he sees the poor as a kid, and then one event that we don't have time to get into, but I mentioned early on, is he was told by somebody who discovered a 9-year-old rape victim. So he's pulled into this and says, "Hey, you need to go get your dad," and so he has to go get his dad, and he is put into a very strict school, military school, and I think this is after the death of his both of his parents, or maybe in between. The memory's fuzzy, but he's put into this very strict military school. He can't find his way. He's called a dreamer, and he's kind of aloof in some sense. He's not really into his studies. He then graduates and decides to write full time. He starts to write, and he becomes an instant, sensation. His book, Poor Folk, goes to the stratosphere. And because of all those experiences and the death of his father, let me put this a parenthetical in here. The death of his father, we don't know if it was a stroke or his serfs killed him. Like, there's debates. A lot of people just go with what the neighbor said, that he was murdered by his serfs, which he was being attacked or assaulted, and that led to the stroke. Anyway, that's Dostoevsky's worldview now. Not worldview. This is Dostoevsky's view of the world. He sees all this suffering, and he gets pulled into with the radicals, and he begins to read poetry with them. They sit around, they talk about how to fix the world. Then he gets arrested, and the mock execution, and then in prison in Siberia for 4 years, then in exile under compulsory military service. Then he comes back, and then he becomes a journalist, and he starts writing in these monthly journals and discussing all this and processing. And the books of the time, the journals of the time, they serialize novels, so they serialize these fictional stories, which under the oppression and censorship had to talk about things without really talking about them. And then he begins to realize that his former life and what he thought would be the answer to the suffering that he saw as a child isn't exactly the answer. And part of it is his conservatism, his traditionalism, his Christianity. So it's not just, he came to this realization or this epiphany. There's always this history. I think his uncles were priests or something too. So his history informs him that, hey, this radical idea is not good. But what makes him unique is he doesn't go to the far right, what we would call it. His traditionalism is tempered, because with the critiques he has about the left radicals, he also has against the right radicals. So that what makes Dostoevsky, despite what his critics might say about him artistically, that he lacks talent there, or one historian said he didn't know what he didn't know, and his writings are all trash. So he actually knows more than his critics give him credit for.
Sure, yeah, but that's the nature of critics, right? Like, they don't
his traditionalism grounds him, as you say, from going off into a different radical extreme.
Yeah, that's something we should definitely talk about.
I guess it's more of a question to maybe aid with the transition. Do we want to talk about anything with the book in general before getting into the plot now, like outside of history and not at the plot, but like, because I know there was a lot of notes about like names and stuff, and I think both Josh and I had similar comments about getting the names mixed up sometimes.
Like, hey, what the hell is a marmeladov? And I'll say, well,
yeah,
it's a jam.
He's actually the one of the few I didn't get confused.
There we go.
Slava, did you say that's a jam?
Marmelade is like a jam, yeah. It's not
marmalade.
Not jam as like
like marmalade.
Yeah,
marmalade,
there it is. Yeah,
that is all super informative, Slava. Stuff that I think, had I been given that information on my first read through when I wrote my article that this is the worst book ever written, maybe I would have appreciated it more. I didn't. I also think I was in a weird spot. So to echo what Christopher talked about, when you read a book for the first time, your current life circumstances certainly play a role in how the flavor of the book is tasted. And I think that that's a topic for another time, but it's certainly a relevant topic because there are books that I've read that like really inspired me at the time, and then there are books like this where I'm like, life was shit, and this book is shit. So
Yeah. Well, like I said, it took me 10 tries to get into it because, I mean, I knew enough about Russian life and culture
I would hope so.
to at least appreciate the artistry of the book, right? But I didn't know enough of the history of what would have been my great-grandparents' history in Russia. And every time I got to the poor horse being beaten in the eye, I was like, I can't take this book. And it's not because I was squeamish. I was just like, I don't know where this is going. And
Right.
it was 10 times, at least between 9 and 11 times that I tried to pick up this book. And when I was in New York going through some horrible shit, and Jonathan knows a little bit about that, I finally sat down and read it. And I think I read it in a week. And I was like, oh, okay, this is a decent book. And then doing research, post-reading about all this stuff that we talked about in this preamble, as we're calling it, I was like, oh, this is more than a decent book. This is a good book.
Right.
There's a reason why it's a classic, and Dostoevsky didn't just pull it out of his posterior. Because they weren't writing fiction like you and I think of fiction, like Brandon Sanderson or even
Correct.
Stephen King, or name your author that we've covered. There was a message hidden in this book to discuss things that maybe weren't supposed to be discussed, and then to actually make a claim, make a worldview claim.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
and we can get into that in the full episode. So be sure to subscribe because that episode comes out very soon, and we'll see you there. I have a favor to ask you. If you like what we're doing, the simplest way to support the show is to hit subscribe. In return, we'll keep leveling up, and we'll listen to your feedback and read authors that you suggest. And of course, we'll take side quests along the way. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.